To live is Christ. To die is gain. This has been the most tragic and bizarre Easter we've ever experienced. More than any other Holy Week, it's pressed the question, what are we living for? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Therefore, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. This is the Shema Israel, and more than anything else, it captures the core belief of Judaism. There is only one God, Yahweh, and he is as far above us as east is from west. The theological term for this is monotheism. And in Jesus' day, to say or do anything that in the slightest way would call into question this belief in the absolute oneness and absolute transcendence of Yahweh, of God, to do that could get you killed. The theological term for that is blasphemy. And by boldly proclaiming Jesus' divinity, the early church was unapologetically committing outright blasphemy. But how could this be? How could the early church, this group of first century Jews who were willing to die for their belief that God is one, ever start proclaiming, many to their actual deaths, that God is now more than one, the Father and the Son? And that's not even the most stunning thing about it. The most stunning thing about this is that the very idea of God becoming a human being, of God being more than one, would have been utterly inconceivable to them. They couldn't even begin to imagine that was possible, let alone give their lives for such a belief. That's a point most people miss. I was having a conversation a few years ago with an Orthodox Jew, a very memorable conversation. She was adamant that Jesus couldn't be God. That wasn't the memorable part about it. The memorable part was how sincerely perplexed she was that I could believe this. See, she genuinely couldn't wrap her mind around the idea, just the idea of God becoming a human being. And so she couldn't fathom, she couldn't comprehend how any sane person could believe that either. For scholars who study the early church, this is the greatest mystery of all. How is it that the early church, this group of first century Jews, who were far more intensely steeped in Jewish monotheism than this woman, ever come to believe that Jesus could actually be Yahweh in the flesh? The only way to explain that, to explain such a radical shift, an unthinkable shift at the core of their worldview, is if they quite literally experienced a mind-blowing event of cosmic proportion. In itself, the resurrection of a flesh and blood body coming back from the dead, that would blow their minds. But, and here's another point that most people miss, overlook. The most mind-blowing thing about it for them was the way that Jesus appeared. As the Gospels depict, Jesus doesn't appear in the way that people expected the resurrected body to be. Jesus appears with what scholars call a glorified body. He's been transformed to the transcendent sphere. He can make his body appear and disappear. He can pass through walls. He has the power to transcend space and time. And here's the key. As only God can, as God alone does, and this is the most mind-blowing thing about it for these first witnesses to the resurrection, as only God alone can, Jesus possesses these transcendent qualities in himself. So for these first witnesses to the resurrection, these first Jewish members of the early church, seeing Jesus appear this way, in possession of the transcendent qualities that only God alone can possess, they couldn't help themselves but make this quantum leap to belief in his divinity. And here's the critical point. It's nearly impossible to explain how the early church, these first century Jews, could ever come to believe in Jesus' divinity unless they did see him rise, and see him rise in this completely unexpected way. To live is Christ. To die is gain. COVID-19 has shaken our sense of security. The things that we have counted on most, the things that we've been living for, our careers and financial security, our health and the well-being of our loved ones, our freedom and our pastimes, these things have been shaken to the core. But the truth is, they really weren't that solid or secure in the first place. We've been living under the illusion that they were, but in reality, they weren't. As this crisis has made us so painfully aware, none of them were really permanent. They all will eventually pass away. There's only one thing that won't pass away. There's only one thing that we can count on. There's only one thing that can give us true security, and that's Jesus Christ and his unfailing love for us. That's what the resurrection reveals. So as we're coming out of this most painful Holy Week ever, we can find true peace, true security, true joy, true hope in his life, death, and resurrection, knowing that the love which propelled him to die on a cross for us, to give his life to save us, is also the same love which conquered death, knowing that he is Lord of all and that he has prepared an eternal home for us. We can say with Paul, to live is Christ and to die is gain. Living for him, what do we have to lose? If we lose our lives, we gain paradise. Living for him, the worst thing that could ever possibly happen to us turns out to be the best thing that could ever happen for us. Living for him, we can't lose. So how was your Easter this year? Was it the most painful Easter you've ever experienced, or in some way was it the most meaningful you've ever experienced? I'd love to hear from you. You can go to the Contact EJ page of the Raising Jesus website and leave your thoughts there. Living for the risen Lord, may you know his mind-blowing peace, joy, and hope.